Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to admit, usually when I prepare for these, I'm expecting a certain vibe. Maybe a tech breakthrough, a historical mystery, something flashy. But today we have a stack of documents on the table that, at first glance, looks like the absolute cure for insomnia.
I can practically hear the listeners reaching for the skip button. Building codes? Regulatory standards, really?
I know. Stick with us. Because
Yeah.
what we found in the source material isn't just dry code. It plays out exactly like a detective story. We are looking at a submission by Janet Tome, that's pronounced Home, but with a T, who is the president of the Tiny House Alliance USA. And if her analysis is correct, the document we are looking at isn't just a set of rules, it is a weapon.
It is a very strong claim, but when you dig into the details, you start to see why she makes it.
The premise here is that a standard known as ICC THIA 1215 is actually a battleground. It is a fight over the future of the tiny house industry, federal law, and the very definition of reality specifically, the difference between a home and a vehicle.
And the stakes are incredibly high. We aren't just talking about, whether your hallway is wide enough or if you have enough outlets in the kitchen. We are talking about a fundamental clash between private industry standards and federal public safety laws. Tome's submission argues that this standard, ICC CTHIA 1215, effectively creates a ghost category of housing.
A ghost category.
It's designed to look like a house, act like a vehicle, but, and this is the crucial part, dodge the safety regulations of both.
So the mission for this deep dive is to unpack that accusation. We're going to look at how a voluntary standard intended to help the tiny house movement might actually be rewriting the rules of the road, literally.
And to do that, we have to start with the crime scene, so to speak. This submission, it documents the development and implementation of this standard, which was jointly promulgated by the International Code Council, the ICC, and the Tiny Home Industry Association, or THIA.
And the source is very specific about the accusation. It says this was undertaken with full knowledge and institutional support to create a, quote, private regulatory regime.
Right. And this is where the detective work starts. Because the source says this whole thing hinges on a concept called regulatory fragmentation.
Which is a fancy way of saying breaking the rules into little pieces so no one notices the big picture.
Exactly. The core charge in the submission is that this standard creates a private compliance path that just sidesteps the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. It takes chassis-based dwellings, things with wheels meant to be towed at highway speeds, and it classifies them as real property, as buildings.
But they're still on wheels. They still move down the highway.
They do, and that is the central tension. You have an object that behaves like a vehicle. It has mass, velocity, kinetic energy, but the paperwork, it claims it's a house. The source argues this reroutes the lawful compliance path. It replaces a uniform national safety framework, the stuff that keeps us safe on the interstate, with a fragmented private system that shifts all the risk onto the consumer and the local inspector.
It's almost like declaring that a tank is actually mobile sporting equipment, so you don't have to register it with the DMV.
That is actually not that far off. The source alleges that this standard is a clear attempt to bypass established federal motor vehicle law. Instead of dealing with the Department of Transportation, or DOT, builders would answer to a private building code.
Okay, let's look at the specific weapon in this detective story. It seems to hinge on a definition. The source makes a huge deal about the difference between a tiny house and something called a small residential unit, or SRU.
This is what the source calls the hijacking phase of the argument. And I use that word because the material explicitly states the standard has been completely hijacked by the small residential unit.
So let's define our terms. We already have a definition for a tiny house, right? It's a real thing.
We do. It is a codified term. If you look at Appendix Q of the International Residential Code, the IRC, a tiny house is defined as a dwelling that is 400 square feet or less. That's what everyone pictures. A compact, efficient space.
Right. 400 square feet. Small, manageable, cute. But then ICC THIA 1215 introduces this new term, the small residential unit.
The SRU. And the standard defines this as a dwelling up to 1,200 square feet.
Wait, 1,200? That's not tiny. That's the size of a standard two-bedroom ranch house in the 1950s.
It is 3 times the size of the industry standard tiny house. And the source argues this term is completely fabricated. It's not used by the public. It's not in zoning laws. It's a made-up term. But by introducing it, the standard creates this massive new umbrella.
So the tiny house just gets swallowed up.
That's the allegation. The submission says that tiny houses have now become an incidental focus of this new standard. The argument is that the authors used the political goodwill of the tiny house movement as a kind of Trojan horse. They started with a mandate to help tiny houses, those 400 square foot units, get better regulations for their chassis. But somewhere along the line, it morphed into a regulatory regime for these massive 1,200 square foot SRUs.
That's a huge shift. You go from trying to help someone build a little cabin on wheels to regulating something that rivals a double-wide mobile home, but without any of the mobile home laws.
Precisely. They want to position the small residential unit, this made-up term, as the dominant category. The source notes that the definition of a tiny house in this new standard is literally a small residential unit, 400 square feet or less.
So they demoted it. The tiny house is now just a subcategory of this thing they invented.
Correct. And by inventing the SRU category, they can claim it's some unique entity that exists outside the current binary of house versus trailer. It lets them supersede existing definitions and just write new rules from scratch.
It feels like a linguistic shell game. You just change the name and suddenly the federal laws don't apply.
And that is exactly what the source calls the silent strategy. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of safety.
Yeah.
And the biggest red flag here, it concerns the VIN, the vehicle identification number.
Most people just think of the VIN as that little plate on the dashboard you have to write down for your insurance.
It is that. But legally, it is the bedrock of highway safety. The source breaks down the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, or FMVSS. A VIN certification label isn't just a sticker. It is a federal requirement permanently affixed by the manufacturer. It is a legal guarantee that the vehicle, and yes, anything on wheels is a vehicle, meets standards for brakes, tires, lighting, coupling, everything.
And crucially, the source points out that this label exists only because the unit is a motor vehicle.
Correct. If it's not a vehicle, it doesn't get a VIN. If it gets a VIN, it is a vehicle. It's a binary system. There's no in-between.
So how does the SRU standard handle this? If these 1,200 square foot behemoths are moving down the highway, surely they need a VIN.
You would think so. But the ICC THIA 1215 standard doesn't require a VIN label. Instead, it creates a substitute. It's called a data plate.
A data plate. It sounds official, at least.
It mimics the look of authority. But look at the details the source provides. The standard says this plate is for the information of code officials, so building inspectors. And where is it located? Inside the unit. The standard suggests placing it under the kitchen sink or near the electrical panel.
I'm sorry, did you say under the kitchen sink?
Yes, inside the cabinet.
I want to pause on that for a second. Imagine a state trooper pulling over a 10,000-pound structure doing 65 on the interstate. It's swaying a bit, maybe the tires look underinflated. The officer walks up. Where do they look?
They look at the tongue of the trailer or maybe the door jamb for that federal VIN label. They need to see the gross vehicle weight rating, the GVWR, to know if the truck towing it is even illegal. They need the tire pressure specs.
They definitely do not walk inside, ask for permission to open the cupboard under the sink, and move the dish soap to read a building code sticker.
Exactly. And that's the aha moment the source highlights. This is a building plate masquerading as a transportation document. By hiding it inside, the standard is physically reinforcing the idea that this is a house, come inside to check it. But the reality of the situation is, this is a heavy object on a public road.
It's dangerous. I mean, if a first responder or an officer can't immediately identify the weight and safety ratings of a vehicle from the outside, that's a massive safety gap.
And the source argues that this gap is intentional. It allows the SRU to exist in this gray zone. It denies the FMVSS applies because they call it a residential unit, but still tries to regulate the chassis.
You mentioned weight just now. This seems to be the smoking gun in the documents. The difference between how a house is measured and how a vehicle is measured.
This is the most technical, yet I think it's the most damning part of Janet Tome's submission. She does a side-by-side comparison of two data plates. First, look at the standard manufacturer's data plate in the International Residential Code, the rules for regular houses.
Okay, I'm picturing the sticker on my furnace or electrical box.
Right. That plate lists design loads: wind load, snow load, seismic category. It tells you if the roof will collapse in a blizzard or if the walls will hold in a hurricane. But, and this is critical, it deliberately excludes the weight of the structure itself.
Because why would you weigh a house? It sits on a concrete foundation. It isn't going anywhere.
Exactly. The earth holds it up. Building codes don't regulate gravity in that sense. But now, look at the SRU data plate proposed in Appendix B of this new standard. It looks just like the building plate, but it quietly inserts a new line item: gross weight of structure.
So they took the building permit and added a trucking metric to it.
They had to, because unlike a normal house, this one moves. But gross weight is a federal transportation concept. It's defined in 49 CFR section 658.17. It's tied to federal bridge formulas, axle spacing, and highway preservation.
The source calls this legal evasion.
It's a workaround. By putting gross weight on an interior building plate, the standard is acknowledging that weight matters. It's admitting, yes, this object has a gross weight that impacts safety, but it's doing it without the federal accountability. It's using the language of the Department of Transportation without the oversight of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA.
It's trying to have it both ways. They want the mobility of a vehicle, but the regulatory freedom of a house.
And the source says you cannot have both. You can't just borrow federal terms and hide them in a kitchen cabinet. It creates a liability nightmare.
Which brings us to what the source calls the fulcrum of the defect. Section 702.1. The wording here seems like a kind of logical trap.
It is a paradox. Let's just read the text. Section 702.1 states, all chassis shall be built in compliance with DOT requirements.
Okay, that sounds responsible. It sounds like they're covering their bases. Follow the law.
It sounds good on the surface, but then it continues.
Oh.
And have verification by documentation regarding loads and weights.
Verification by documentation. What's wrong with that?
The problem is the definition of documentation. Under federal law, there is only one valid way to prove DOT compliance for a vehicle. That is the VIN-linked self-certification label we just talked about. There is no other document. You can't show a pile of blueprints. You can't show them a letter from an engineer saying, trust me, it's strong.
The label is the documentation.
Right. But ICC THIA 1215 defines construction documents as plans, drawings, and specifications. So the standard creates this loop. You must prove DOT compliance, but you must use construction documents to do it. But construction documents cannot legally prove DOT compliance.
So it's impossible to comply.
It requires you to prove a negative using the wrong evidence. The source argues this effectively erases the federal requirement. By forcing builders to use building docs to prove vehicle specs, it sidesteps the need for the actual VIN label. It allows a builder to say, look, I have a stack of paper that says this chassis is good, without ever actually registering it as a vehicle with the feds.
And that leads to what the source calls the Easter egg scheme. I love this term, though it's not exactly festive here.
No, it's about hiding things in plain sight. Tome's submission argues that this regulatory fragmentation is intentional.
How so?
Well, imagine if they wrote all these requirements in one single paragraph. Imagine if the standard said, this is a chassis-based unit with a gross weight of 10,000 pounds, requiring DOT compliance, brake lights, and a VIN.
If you read that, you'd say, that's a trailer. That's a vehicle.
Exactly. And if it's a vehicle, it falls under NHTSA jurisdiction. The building code officials would lose control over it. So the theory is that the authors of the standard just split it all up.
They scattered the clues.
The DOT mention is in Section 702. The chassis rules are somewhere else. The gross weight requirement is hidden way back in Appendix B. The data plate location is in another section entirely.
So if you just read one section, it looks innocent.
Right. It's only when you assemble the whole machine, find all the Easter eggs, that you realize they are regulating a motor vehicle without ever using the word vehicle in a way that triggers federal law.
This sounds like a nightmare for the inspectors on the ground. The source calls this the inspection paradox.
It puts the authorities having jurisdiction, the AHJs, in an impossible spot. These are building inspectors. They know concrete, wood framing, electrical wiring. The standard tells them to verify compliance with the IRC. But the IRC doesn't define small residential units.
So the inspector is holding a checklist for a small residential unit, but the code book, in his other hand, has never heard of such a thing.
Correct. They are being asked to enforce rules for a ghost category. And because the inspector isn't a DOT officer, they aren't trained to inspect chassis wells, axle ratings, or brake assemblies.
So what happens?
The source calls it circular enforcement. It becomes based on builder self-attestation. The builder says it complies. They put a sticker in the closet that says it complies. The inspector looks at the sticker and says, okay, you have the sticker, and they sign off.
Because what else can they do? There is no federal baseline to check against because the VIN is missing.
Precisely. It removes the third-party federal oversight and replaces it with a private loop of trust me.
This brings us to the big question. Why? Why go through all this effort to invent a ghost category, hide the weight ratings in a kitchen cabinet, and dodge the VINs? What is the end game here?
The source is very clear on this. It's about a reset.
A reset of the entire industry.
Think about the economics. Currently, the tiny house industry is very decentralized. You have a lot of artisans, small builders, DIYers. They rely on the critical paths. If they build on wheels, they build a travel trailer, get a VIN, and comply with NHTSA. It's a clear federal path.
It's accessible.
But if this standard takes over and the SRU becomes the only recognized way to build a tiny home, you create a massive barrier to entry. The source argues this creates an unlawful exception or an independent carrier system.
It favors the big players.
The ones with a capital to navigate a complex private regulatory regime. If you are a large manufacturer, you might prefer this SRU category because it avoids the strict federally enforced recalls and safety standards of the auto industry. You're shifting the playing field from auto safety, which is strict, to building code, which is more flexible and localized.
So the small builder who has been doing it right, getting VINs, building safe trailers, is suddenly outlawed.
Or at least forced into a system that renders their compliance pathway obsolete. The source says this destabilizes the industry. It replaces a uniform national framework, the law of the land, with a private patchwork that varies from town to town.
It shifts the risk from the manufacturer to the consumer and the town.
And the submission claims this was done with full knowledge. It describes it as affirmative recommendations to avoid FMVSS and HUD. It wasn't an accident, it was a strategy to carve out a new market niche that is exempt from the hard rules.
It really is a detective story. You have the weapon, the SRU definition, you have the motive market control and avoiding federal oversight, and you have the cover-up, the silent strategy, and the hidden data plates.
And at the center of it all is a basic physical reality. We keep coming back to physics. You cannot regulate a chassis without talking about transportation.
So as we wrap up this investigation, what's the ultimate takeaway? What does Janet Tome and the Tiny House Alliance USA conclude?
The takeaway is the mic drop from the submission. It's a simple legal reality. You cannot invoke DOT requirements for a chassis while denying the only federal method to prove it, the VIN label.
You can't have the benefits of a vehicle without the responsibilities of a vehicle.
And you cannot have gross weight, a measure of mass and momentum hidden on a building plate in a kitchen cabinet. The laws of physics don't care about your definitions. If that hitch fails at 65 miles per hour, gravity and inertia are going to take over.
That's the scary part.
And federal law is pretty strict about what constitutes a vehicle. If it's designed to use the highway, it's a vehicle. No amount of renaming it an SRU or a movable living module changes that statutory fact.
It raises a really provocative thought to leave our listeners with. We often think of regulations as boring paperwork, but here they determine reality.
Right.
If this standard is adopted and we start seeing thousands of these small residential units on the highways, 1,200 square feet, heavy, massive structures with nothing but a sticker under the sink to certify their safety, who is liable when something goes wrong?
That is the question. Is it the builder who followed the standard? Is it the local building inspector who signed off on a house that turned out to be a runaway trailer? Or is it the standard writing body that created the confusion in the first place?
It's a game of liability hot potato.
And right now, the source argues that hot potato is being tossed directly into the lap of the unsuspecting consumer and the public driving in the lane next to them.
That is a sobering thought. A huge thank you to Janet Tome, Home with a T, and the Tiny House Alliance USA for the source material for this deep dive. It's a dense topic, but one that impacts anyone interested in the future of housing and, honestly, anyone who drives on a highway.
It's a hidden war of definitions, but the consequences are very real.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Keep questioning the fine print.
See you next time.